For those that I haven't met, Kyle Barker, Barker Architects, I've been working on this facilities assessment study for a number of months now and have come to a close conclusion of that. And I have a copy of the report with me. I don't have multiple copies, but I'll send this around for people to take a look at. And then I've got a synopsis that I'm going to show in a PowerPoint presentation. Just keep in mind that this is a pretty sizable document. Here, let me pass this around. I've got 8 worksheets per school times 5 schools, and some of those worksheets are multiple per option. There's 8 options, so we're talking a lot of data in this report. So there's a lot to go over, and if anybody's seen some of my presentations in the past, I can get deep into the weeds on some of this information, and I don't want people to become overwhelmed with it. So if there's a point at which I'm going too fast, or things are not understood, or maybe I'm going a little too deep, just let me know and we can adjust and try to keep things moving along. Give me a second while I plug in.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Colleen, can you move to one of these seats? Thank you.
Yeah. Just waiting for the things to boot up. I guess the
I didn't mean for good.
Oh, well, now I got all this stuff.
A few other things to kind of cover before we get straight into it is that the numbers that I'm going to present tonight are somewhat academic in that there's, again, a lot of data. There could be small errors contained within there, but I just want folks to know that if there are, that it generally isn't going to affect the overall outcome of the results, that the delta between the different options is still going to stay about the same. But that, keep in mind, this is not a completed project either. This is just simply a study. So if I were to say that something's a certain number, it could be plus or minus a good 10, 20% in the end, but you're not going to have an option that, say, 25 million turn into 50 million. It might go from 25 to 27, maybe creep up a little bit more from there, but we're not talking, by multiple times the number.
Let's pause for just a second. Does everyone feel comfortable with the lights on? Are you able to see well enough? All right. And those of you in the audience, if you want to slip over this way, feel free.
The next piece I'd kind of like to go through quickly is a recap of what we learned from the State Department of Education. That we know that in July, the legislature lifted the moratorium on school funding, and in September, they started funding projects for the what they're calling the 2020 budget cycle, which started July 1st, 2019 and goes through until June 30th of 2021. So the soonest that any district is going to receive new districts are going to receive additional aid would be July 1st of 2021 with an application deadline of 2020. So we've essentially got, whatever that is, 8 months to pull together an application for the state in order to get funded in 2021. So this is a fairly tight deadline, but at this point in time, I'm feeling pretty confident that this district would be set up nicely to be able to accomplish that. We met with Amy Clark from the Department of Education yesterday, went through a number of items. She's now familiar with the buildings, familiar with the report. She has a copy of it. And so, again, trying to make sure that as we move forward that we're set up nicely with the Department of Education, because keep in mind, this new style of funding is a competitive process, and that I have a list here of school projects that are in the works in the next few years, and there's quite a few of them. I believe there's over 30. And so if we were to miss this round, what Amy had said yesterday is expect that a lot of these that are not prepared to apply this year will be in 2 years. So there could be a lot more competition in the future. Right now, before the floodgates open, is an opportunity for this district to be able to get in there first. One other thing I thought was important that Amy said was, if this district were to, if any district is to apply, if they're approved, but then the state doesn't fund it, that doesn't kick you off the list. You stay on the list until you get funding. So if there's 10 projects that apply and only 8 get approved, if you're number 9, the next biennium, you're number 1. So you don't have to go through and get reapproved. So getting an application in and getting approved is a very positive thing, even if the project doesn't move forward right away. So if there's any questions on the state funding, we're all still learning a lot about what's going on because we haven't had to go through this in 10 years, but I feel like we've got a fair amount of information now and know how to navigate this system. All right, so what I'd like to do is review in sort of a high altitude view of the report. I don't want to get into every page, but I do want to give you a synopsis. First of all, I want to kind of go through what my methodology was in creating this report. That the first section is basically a narrative of the buildings, narrative of the programs, and a narrative of how I came up with it. And then the majority of it in the back are these worksheets. And what you'll see here is across the top are the drawings, which include the site plan, a code review plan, and then a use diagram that shows us where the different parts of the building are, where the gym is, where the classrooms are, and to try to organize it in a way that you can graphically see how the building's being used. These worksheets down below are the code review worksheets. There's general information, there's a life safety code review, and then there's international building code review. Life safety code is not grandfathered. Every school is supposed to meet that as it exists. The international building code is grandfathered, but if there's any project that moves forward in the future, you would have to then bring your current building up to that code. So it's worth diving into it and understanding where the current buildings sit in terms of that code. Okay. This next series of worksheets, the first one here, the large one, is the facilities assessment, and essentially goes through item by item and identifies deficiencies and puts a cost to it, and then the costs are then broken into priority. So there's a high, medium, and low priority. Most of this data came from the Turner Group report that was done previously. Some of it was done, added to by me, and also subsequently in further investigations afterwards. So it's color coded at the bottom so you can see where the data came from, what it was mean for the Turner Group. But by and large, tried to reuse as much of the existing information as possible to be efficient. This next worksheet is the curriculum worksheet, which basically tells me how many classrooms are required for each of these facilities for a certain enrollment. And it basically studies, kids don't come in neat little packages of 25, so I need to know, if there's a policy, if we're trying to limit a class size to 20, which rooms it's going to fit in, and how those students move through the building. This next worksheet basically takes that curriculum analysis and creates a space needs program. So throughout all this, I now know what the deficiencies are, and then what our requirement for square footage is. And at the bottom, it'll compare the existing versus what's required for new. So we'll have a cost for renovations that's coming out of the deficiencies, and then we have a projection for additions that are required for each of the buildings. And again, this is also adjusted for each of the different options that we've been looking at in the future. Is everybody still with me on this?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
This next worksheet is a bond cost analysis. So if we have, in this particular case, I used the new elementary school as an example. I look at the cost per square foot for new construction, the cost per square foot for renovations. I then apply soft costs, which include design fees, equipment and furniture, administrative costs that include surveys and testing, clerk of the works, things of that nature, and then also apply contingency to it. So when I talk about the costs, I just want people to understand that this is not just I think it's $5 million. This I've drilled down to understand to the square foot what these costs represent. Here's something new on this side is a life cycle cost analysis. And this is going to be required by the State Department of Education in future projects. They've never had this before. This is a brand new thing. And most architects that have done life cycle cost analysis stop at utilities. They basically look at the building needs assessment and then look at utilities. I've added to that two other topics, one being the cost in human resources, and the last being the financial piece. The human resources basically relates to staffing and teachers. Essentially, if you have an existing building that is the finishes are worn, the layout is poor, it's going to cost more for the staff to clean it. That's part of this worksheet. If you've got classrooms that overheat or have bad ventilation, teachers are going to call in sick more often. So absenteeism can be calculated and actually put a number to, because you need to hire a substitute teacher to take over for that position. So these are real costs, and what I've found out is that the human aspect of the life cycle cost is actually the bigger number in terms of the life cycle. It's much larger than your energy costs or some of the other maintenance costs that go into the building. So the human aspect is a very important piece, and again, I vetted this with Amy Clark from the Department of Education yesterday, and she really appreciated this part of the study. The last piece at the bottom is the finances, which includes, if there is a bond, what the cost of the bond is, and to prorate it out over the life of the bond and add the interest. But I also realized that there could be an offset to that, and that is if you've got a new school and you're closing another school, that school wouldn't necessarily disappear. It still exists. If that were sold or even given to a private developer that would turn it into a commercial or residential project, that project would then go on the tax rolls, and the town would receive a tax benefit of that building being taxable. So there's actually a way to calculate that and put that in this figure in this worksheet as well. So I tried as much as possible to calculate all the different elements that are affected by a building project, so that way the full cost of the project is completely understood. And it did create some surprises. One thing I do want to point out is that I did the life cycle cost to a limit of 10 years, because anything past that, then I'm really guessing on a lot of stuff. The problem with it, though, is you need to understand is that the bonds are generally 20 years. So I'm only showing the first 10 years of a bond payment in the life cycle cost analysis. I feel this is okay because what it shows is what your upfront costs are, your short-term costs are, and what that does is it allows a good chunk of the bond to be paid for by future residents in town. This helps to actually lower the cost for elderly, people on fixed income, and shifts some of that burden to future younger people that move into town later. So if people have an issue with that, we can certainly make some adjustments in these life cycle cost analysis, but I just want to point out the complexity and the importance of these different numbers. Is there any questions on the worksheet so far? I want to get into an overview of each of the schools to give you a sense of how I feel about them, but before that, I just wanted to check in again to make sure I got everybody. Yep.
Yeah. Hi, Kyle. Scott Peters.
Sure.
What assumptions did you make about the sale of existing buildings? Did you assume
Sure.
that they would sell, or did you assume that we have a maintenance cost to keep the pipes from freezing? Or
So in any of the options where a school is closed, I assumed that there'd be no income from the sale of the property, and I only calculated the income from it being taxed. And I assumed that the buildings were assessed at roughly $30 a square foot, which is a very low figure. If instead a school building were sold, you'd have that money that would add to these or subtract from the costs. And if they were assessed at a higher value, that would only help out the numbers. So the numbers that I've got are very, very conservative. It probably would be more in your favor in the end.
Okay.
All right. So the schools, in general, I want to say is that they are actually in better shape than a lot of schools that I've been in. I've been in a lot of schools throughout New Hampshire, and I've been in some that are in just terrible, terrible conditions. I think a lot of that has to do with the maintenance staff, keeping up with the cleanliness, keeping up with things that are broken. But a lot of the stuff that's in my report are items that are way past just maintenance or cleanliness or upkeep. So I want to make sure that nobody feels I'm throwing anybody under the bus, that the staff has taken pride in these buildings, which actually makes it a tougher job for me because I'm trying to point out what all the problems are. But I think that's a good thing. But you need to recognize that there are significant problems. There are some code issues. There are some things that need to be changed. But I also want to say that there's nothing that makes these buildings unsafe the way they are. But keep in mind that some of these code issues are significant and do need to get changed at some point in the future. I'm going to start alphabetically, and so we're going to start with Cutler. Cutler, I think, is a very typical building in this district in that it was started with a small historic building that was added onto multiple times. I think I've counted at least 6 additions to the school. And so the school has kind of grown organically over the last, 80 years or so of its life. This is a bad thing because with each addition may have made sense to that architect at the time, but I wish that he was here. I could ask him, why did you do that? Because in the end, the whole campus just doesn't really work. Most of these buildings are very sprawling. Lots of exterior walls, lots of nooks and crannies, and certain areas that just don't work. And so trying to reorganize that in some way to make it work has been kind of difficult, particularly at Cutler. Cutler, the original building's wood framed, and then there was essentially a 3-story addition put in the back. And that is the original building is in this location here, and that small addition that's 3 stories is connected there. There's a stair in the middle of that. There's actually 2 stairs that connect different levels. They're not fire rated. They don't make sense in terms of flow of traffic. And they're not handicap accessible. There is a stair lift that connects some of the floors. That stair lift actually impedes on egress as you're going down the stairs. And there's at least one area, the main area in the front where there's 3 steps down, that's just not handicap accessible at all. So the way that has been put together is difficult for me to work with. Then there was an addition, a 1-story addition here, another addition here and here, then the gym addition, and then the surprise part was the 2 classrooms in the back are actually portable classrooms. They're not permanent. They were put there in the 90s, but they were called out on the plans as being portable, and if you take a quick look at them, they're not really well constructed. With all that said, actually the worst thing about Cutler is the site. The site, I've actually drawn the property lines around it, and the property lines are only 20 or 30 feet off the building. The rest of the property is actually owned by the town, from what I understand looking at the surveys. Besides that, the real problem area is this across the front, that the original building and a good chunk of the the additions are in an area that are too close to the property line that there's no way to make any kind of additions or modifications work to that. So any addition would have to basically go on town property, and it would cause an even more sprawling effect to the layout of the building. There's actually one spot right in here where it's marked as a fire lane, but it's less than 20 feet, which is not legal for a fire lane. Anyway, so any questions on Cutler? Am I going too fast? Am I, okay.
Scott,
Yeah.
and if folks wanted to read more, just because I did see the report, folks wanted to drill down on Cutler, it's in that report.
Yes. Yeah, and there's photographs that spell out what some of these issues are.
Actually, do you want to pass yours around too, and all? That way we have 3 going around? Since
Is there much difference in the draft version?
There's subtle differences.
20, 30 million.
Moving on to Emerson. Emerson at first blush is a pretty decent building, but then as I drilled into it, it suffers from a lot of the same effects that Cutler does. The original building is this piece up in front. It's a 2-story piece. It has open stairways. It has corridors that are too narrow. It has a few different code issues that really need to be addressed. I believe that the lower level should not be used because of some of those issues. From there were multiple additions. I believe 2, 3, 4, 5. So multiple additions. And what was interesting about those is that they're not very efficient. The corridors are very long. They're single loaded, meaning that there's a corridor with classrooms just on one side and then windows on the other, making the distance that you have to travel throughout the building much longer than you would in a more compact design. So in terms of ergonomics for the teachers, it's pretty poorly laid out. It's a wood frame building, which it's not a problem per se, but it's not like this building, which is block and brick and substantial. It's a wood frame, more residential style, and not as durable. A lot of the ceilings are drywall, which makes it difficult to work with. You'll see from the pictures in the report that because of the drywall ceilings, a lot of the heating pipes have been run below the ceilings and exposed. It just makes the overall look of the building, fairly less quality than what you would want to expect in a school building. There's some areas of interest where there must have been ledge or something, and so they raised the floor and ramped up to it. Well, the ramps, caused some disruption in the corridor pattern. There's one area that's below code height for head height. There's railings that don't meet code. The contractor that built that addition at the time probably saved $5,000 or $10,000 because they didn't have to blast the ledge, but you've paid way more than that in terms of lack of efficiency in that building ever since then. Any questions on Emerson? Am I going too fast?
What about the site for Emerson?
Oh, sure. All right. So the site, good question. The site's rather large and rather flat, and so it's actually a pretty good site. The thing is that the survey that I received only had this part of it. I believe the school district actually owns a much bigger piece. Dave could it's like 28 acres, something like that. So it's a much bigger piece, and you can see that the play fields are off to the side. The downside to it, though, is, again, your distance to the property line is fairly close to the building on at least 2 or 3 sides of it, and that makes getting bus and car traffic. Essentially, the Department of Education, for good reasons, wants to see buses and parent pickup and drop off completely separate, and with sites this tight, it's really difficult to do that. Moving on to Gilsum. Gilsum's a little bit of an enigma because it's so small compared to the other schools. But with that said, it has a lot of the same issues. It has, I believe, 1, 2, at least 3 additions, if not 4 additions. And for a school that size, that's pretty significant. It has a 2-story section with a stairway. That appears to be the code, but this last classroom down at the end is over 1,000 square feet and doesn't have 2 means of egress. And there's no way of making 2 means of egress because it's a good 5 to 10 feet out of the ground because of the way that the grade slopes. Some of the bigger issues, though, are the front entrance. The front entrance in this plan, you would think that it's here where you enter, but this is actually a courtyard, and that the entrance to the school itself is located deep inside. This part of the building is actually the cafeteria, and this part of the building is actually the gymnasium. And so it's difficult in this day and age to suggest having the main entrance so remote from where people actually enter the building. Homeland Security has outlined, how schools should be designed for security. In this day and age, post-Columbine and Sandy Hook, we've spent a lot of time. In fact, in the past couple of years, the state has invested a lot of money in upgrading public school entrances so that they're more secure. I've done 5 myself in the last 2 years, and in each case, those entrances are located where the staff can see who's coming and going from the site. Then, once they enter the building, they enter into the main office, not into the corridor. And that from that point, they check in with somebody at a window and then are allowed through a locked door to the rest of the building. I should have pointed out before I started that I don't believe any of these schools have that situation. That all the schools, you enter into the corridor and there's nothing stopping you from continuing down to the classrooms. Gilsum being one of the worst because the principal's office is actually, way deep inside the building, a long distance away from the entrance long distance away from the parking, making a visual contact with anybody coming and going almost impossible. And this building also being wood framed, there's a list in the report, obviously, of deficiencies that need to be fixed. And then the site is, as I mentioned earlier, is sloped. This area slopes pretty dramatically on this side. This area is fairly flat and open, but the way that the school is kind of tucked up against the driveway coming in makes getting bus and car separation difficult. Back to my original comment, though, because it's such a small school, it kind of deviates from the norm in terms of of some of those requirements. With only 60-something students, there's just not as much traffic as you would have at, say, Mount Caesar. Any questions? Mount Caesar. Mount Caesar's the...
I'm sorry.
Yep.
The property lines for Gilsum, they weren't drawn, and we've been told that Gilsum is on town property. Is it not?
It is?
I don't know if the school itself is, but most of that's around.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think you didn't drive
Honestly, I don't have a survey for the property, so I didn't draw them on, so I don't know.
Okay.
That's a good question, though.
There was a land swap when the addition was put on, but I don't know the exact property lines. I could try to find out.
That's a good question. I should look into that. Thank you. Mount Caesar. Mount Caesar has a lot of the same issues, security, the way it's grown up organically. But the difference here is that Mount Caesar's had the most attention over the last few years, including an addition that was just completed last year. And most of the systems, the mechanical, electrical, plumbing, things of that nature, have been updated. And so we've actually been using the outline specifications, the pieces and parts of this building as our benchmark for bringing all the other buildings up to the same level. We want to make sure that, when these projects are done, that the students are receiving the same experience no matter which school they're going to. And so we're using Mount Caesar as that template for going forward. That said, it still, again, has some of the same issues in terms of the numerous additions that it's had. The space usage is a little awkward in some areas. The biggest issue, though, is that it does not have a gymnasium. It has a cafeteria that's rather small, but when there's phys ed activities, it happens in the cafeteria, and it's just not the right size. So this school really should have an addition for a gymnasium, and again, the main entrance needing a more of a control from the administrative offices. To the site is the largest amongst the district, and it's relatively flat and open. And so if there were an addition to this building, it would be relatively easy to be able to site something on here. So unlike Gilsum or Cutler, and even some of the other ones, this one seems to have the most opportunities for new projects. Troy. Troy, when I first went there, felt a little disappointing because of the site being so tight and the building being so old. But the more that I've dug into it, I've discovered a few things that are both good and bad about it that I want to share with you folks. I guess let's start with the site on this one, in that the roadway coming in starts here. Currently, you park around the back, but this whole area in the back of the school is a very steep slope down to a wetland. And so we're really limited on essentially three sides, because you've got the driveway, the roadway here, and then this steep slope in the back. We're really limited in terms of the size of the site. That said, the original building and its first addition, which was done like back in the 20s, is a 3-story brick structure. And so it puts a lot of square footage on a very small footprint. That helps this school fit on this site. There was I think 1950s addition that added the gymnasium and then a 1-story classroom wing. That wing does not function well at all. Some of the classrooms are too small. The kitchen is very small. And this intersection between the classroom wing and the 3-story original building is not to code, is not handicap accessible, is not visually attractive. It's not visually connected to the parking for security. It has multiple issues. Back to the site for a second, there was, I saw some drawings that showed the potential of an addition out the side over here, because it's relatively flat, relatively open. And that beyond that is playground area and some playfield areas. Now, I don't know, don't have the boundaries on this site. I believe that this whole area in the back is owned by the school district, but it's not usable because it's wet. And so the site is a bit of a challenge, but what's interesting about it is the fact that the existing building is 3 stories and is able to squeeze a lot in a small space. Kind of is attractive to me in a number of different ways. Also, the fact that it's a historic building, 1895, it from the outside, it's actually a gorgeous building. On the inside, it has not had a lot of attention recently and is in desperate need. Any questions on the buildings? Any surprises? Yes?
Yeah, on Emerson, it mentions in there that the heating plant is antiquated. And since then, this has been, last day, just a brand new system put in, about $125 or so dollars. And is that going to be revised in that report to show that it has been improved?
At Emerson?
At Emerson. Ask Dave if it's been finished yet.
The delivery system is not updated, and that's where the pipes are running down the corridors. There's metal fin tube radiation that's pretty antiquated that runs through the corridors. I actually have a picture of one of them with foam across it, because obviously somebody had been hitting it, and it was for protection. So the heating system is not fully up to date.
Talking the distribution system.
The distribution system,
Okay,
yes.
I assume that the heater had a lot to do with it.
Furnace.
With 5 schools to keep track of, I might have missed one, but I believe that what I put in the report was just talking about the distribution and the ventilation system.
I understand the difference
Okay.
now.
Sure. Anything else on the conditions? How am I doing on time? Am I kind of running short here?
I'd like to make a motion to extend the time.
Yeah, just go ahead on.
Just keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. So quickly, the next step going forward, we need to know how many students we're designed to. So I've received historic enrollment data from the superintendent's office and have done my own investigation on enrollments and have come to a recommendation of where we need to design to. This is really important because, again, the Department of Education is going to want to know what we're doing, and they want the backup data so that they can feel confident that we haven't overshot. If we're going to say that if we're looking for state aid on a building that's twice as big as what we need, they're not going to supply that. So this part of it's actually one of the more important parts of the report. Essentially, right now you're at about 966, I think, for the elementary school levels, and the enrollment projections are not showing any kind of an increase. In fact, some of the tracks are showing a decrease. So my recommendation is designed for just over 1,000 students. It gives it a little bit of a buffer. It's a conservative, reasonable amount that I could justify to the Department of Education. I want to quickly just talk about demographics in terms of where the locations are. I've got a map here of the lower 4 towns. It's not showing Gilsum or Roxbury, but Swansea, in terms of the population, is just about half of the population of the district. Troy being a fifth, I believe, Fitzwilliam a fifth, Richmond being something less than that, and Roxbury and Gilsum much less than that. Roxbury and Gilsum total, I think, is about 8% of the population. So what we're looking at here in this map is about 90% of the population that's being served. The circles represent a mile radius around each of the schools that are currently being operated. So I just want to show this so you can keep it in mind when we start talking about changing locations of schools or consolidation, that it's not just about finding a new site and putting a school down. It's about finding the appropriate site that's going to connect your different communities. And just another map of showing the roadways. And what I thought was interesting about this is that some of the towns are not well connected in terms of roadways. So if you live in Richmond, you can get to Swansea very easy, and you can get to Fitzwilliam very easy, but getting over to Troy is not so easy. So I'm trying to be sensitive about people's experiences as they're going back and forth between the towns. We all know that going from one end of the district, Fitzwilliam to Gilsum, is a long haul. But as we work this down, trying to keep in mind what those, not make some of those situations any worse. This is the list of the options. I know it's kind of hard to read on this small list. Now, this from here on is not in the book. So this is going to be an appendix that's going to be added to it. Essentially, what I wanted to do is keep the facilities assessment study simply existing conditions. In the last page, I did list out some options, and from this point forward, going to be developing that even more, and I'll show you what I've done so far. Essentially, working with the committee, we started out with 5, expanded to 7, and currently have 8 options. The first option is the do-nothing option, and obviously that's not viable because I'm here because the conditions are not working. But I think it's important to list that out to say that we do understand what the pros and the cons are for doing absolutely nothing. Yeah.
Does the do-nothing option include what we have been doing in terms of pay-as-you-go?
No.
Thank
No.
you.
The second option is the pay-as-you-go. So basically looks at the report.
I can't see that from here.
I know, it's pretty small. I'm having a hard time reading it. The second option is pay-as-you-go, which basically means that every item that's in the facilities assessment report gets done, and I spread it out over 10 years, and it includes also adding square footage for the buildings that need it. There's, the good news is that it gets everything completed. The bad news is that it's a lot of money per year. We're talking at least a couple $1 million per year to be invested into this in order to catch up with all those things that need to happen. It's a significant amount of money. Option 3 is, what is option 3? To do that same amount of work, but instead of prorating it over 10 years, to bond the renovations and additions and do it in 1 year. You might think that that'd be more expensive than prorating it or than pay-as-you-go, but the fact is, pay-as-you-go means that some projects don't get done for 10 years. Inflation in construction has been significant over the last 5 years, like close to 5% in some years. So when you times 5% times 5 years, you've got a lot of money that you've spent on inflation that you're not going to get anything for it. Bond rates have been hovering around 2.5%. So by bonding the project, you're going to beat inflation by 2.5%. So, yeah.
Now, does this option that you're speaking about take under account if we make all the infrastructure improvements that we need to in a single year? Let's say we're able to do that. We're assuming a bond of 10, 20 years.
A lot, yeah.
And what are the life cycle costs that we're going to experience in that time frame? Because I'm assuming that even if we put all the funds that are required into these renovations, we're going to have to do some sort of building improvement in 5 or 10 years down the road. It's not just going to be like you build it and then hands off for 20 years.
Well, so if everything in the report is completed, then yeah, it would be hands off for 5 to 10 years. After 10 years, you're right. There's probably some other things coming in, but I'm assuming that we're going to bring all the buildings up to the same level as Mount Caesar.
Okay.
One of the downsides to that is that's a lot of work to happen in 1 year, and that means a huge disruption to every school all at once. It'd be difficult to handle. Other cons are, a benefit here is on the do-nothing scheme or the pay-as-you-go scheme, you're spending money on heating and electricity on systems that are older until they get done. So if you're putting things off for 5 years, you're paying 5 years of high maintenance cost, and then finally getting that down. With the pay all up front, you at least get the benefit of that lower energy cost up front, and hopefully lower staffing in terms of maintenance and cleaning and teacher performance, things of that nature. The biggest issue, though, is some of the biggest problems, such as the site at Cutler, does not get addressed. So option 2 is not really viable because we can't fix everything. It doesn't get to the level that we really want to get to. So option 4 explores the idea of a new school. So essentially, it combines Fitzwilliam and Troy into a single new school on a new property. The benefits here is that, first of all, one of the good things is that it's less disruption to the schools. You could build a new school while the existing schools are being operated and then move the students out of the existing schools into the new school. There's almost no disruption to education. The bad news here is that it doesn't explore what happens at Cutler. We're still doing the upgrades to Cutler, and as I said, the site there is impossible to fix. What else was there? So a natural progression from option 4 was option 5, which is new school for Troy and Fitzwilliam, and closing Cutler and doing an addition to Mount Caesar. So essentially what we end up having is a south school for Troy and Fitzwilliam, a north school for Swansea only, and then Gilsum stays the way it is. This one the committee felt was viable, that it solved most, if not all, the issues, and results in the best for education. We'll get into the cost in a second here, but so the next sort of evolution from that, or the next option that was explored was, all right, if a new school is such a good idea, why don't we just build one new school for all the towns? We could put it somewhere, probably in Swansea, and it would house 1,000 students. The problem with that is 1,000 students is really way too much for an elementary school. If you think about the experience of a kindergartner coming to school for the first time, and it's an enormous building with a lot of kids, it is just not a good experience. It's not a good experience for the teachers that have to deal with that many students. It's difficult for me to design places such as the cafeteria where it's not going to be too crowded and too loud and too chaotic. In my studies, what I've seen is that a school somewhere between 400 and 600 students is really your sweet spot in terms of the size of a school. Over that becomes less desirable. Under that is certainly less desirable. I think one of the things I should have pointed out at the beginning is that the state is, when it comes to funding, one of their criteria that they're looking at is consolidation. They don't want to see schools that are under 240 students. They're not putting a limit to how big you can be, but the smaller schools, they are looking at trying to consolidate. So consolidating into a single school, not recommended just because due to the size. So back to number 7 is sort of a evolution of option 5, which essentially takes that one step further and says, we'll have a new South Elementary School on a new site for Troy and Fitzwilliam, and then a new North Elementary School at Swansea at the Mount Caesar site that would include the students from Gilsum. So we would close Emerson, Troy, and Gilsum in option number 7.
In Cutler, right?
And Cutler. Thank you.
Can you repeat that?
So option number 7 is to create a North Elementary School at the Mount Caesar site, a new South Elementary School on a new site somewhere between Fitzwilliam and Troy, and to close Cutler, Gilsum, Troy, and Emerson. So you'd reduce from 5 schools down to 2. And another evolution from that then is the idea, it's pretty much the same thing, 2 schools, north and south, but instead of closing Troy, you would locate the South Elementary School at the Troy site. I believe this is a possibility because I've worked on similar projects. A school that I designed in Wilton, the Florence Wright Elementary School, was a 55,000 square foot building on a 2-acre site. So we were able to basically fit 55,000 square feet because we put most of it in a multi-story building. And if anybody wants to see pictures or to see it, I'm more than willing to show it to you. So I believe that option is viable. There's a number of benefits to that. One being energy costs. A 3-story building has less exterior walls and exterior roofs, and energy usage is down. It preserves a historic building, and it also preserves the location in the more densely occupied area in these towns. If you look back at the map, the first one showed highlights of the denser populated areas, and when I found out from doing a little research is that the downtown in Troy is the most dense of any of those southern towns. So with that, I'm going to move into analyzing these options in terms of cost. So the this worksheet basically just lays out the total project cost. on the construction side of things. So the do-nothing scheme obviously has no construction that happens, so therefore there's no upfront cost. Option 2, it's pay-as-you-go, so therefore there is no upfront total cost for that either. The additions renovations district-wide in 1 year has a bond cost for each of the schools, and the total for all 5 schools is just over $22 million. Option 4, the new South Elementary School, the elementary school itself is just shy of $15 million. And then there's additions and renovations to Cutler, Gilsum, and Mount Caesar for a total of about $25 million. Option number 5, one of the ones that the committee wanted to explore more, closes Cutler, Emerson, and Troy. A new elementary school is about $15 million. And then the additions and renovations to Gilsum and Mount Caesar bring the total for that option up to just shy of $30 million. One new elementary school is actually the most costly, ends up being just over $30 million. The option 7, another option favored by the building committee, the new South Elementary School, and then a North Elementary School at Mount Caesar. The total there comes in at about $27 million. It's about $18 million for the new school and $9 million for Mount Caesar. Now, I think I want to stop and kind of explain the numbers a little bit here, in that what we're seeing is that the reason why a new elementary school is higher than these other options is that there is value in the existing buildings. I'm taking that into consideration. If you're building 100,000 square feet of new construction, that's one number. But if you're only building 50,000 square feet of new construction, but then doing some renovations, it's a different number, and it's going to be lower. Yep.
What happened on your previous one? We had talked about doing something with Troy and Swansea, combining, and then keeping Fitzwilliam and Gilsum open. What happened to that?
It basically morphed into this last option. And essentially, I had a really hard time making the numbers work, because Emerson, being so small, was still at the low end, at the point where the Department of Education would not look favorably at it. And so we needed to get the schools up around the 400 student mark, and I just had a hard time making those different connections work in terms of the districting. How I morphed that suggestion was to basically say, all right, instead of going across town, keeping solid to town lines and moving students back and forth, to basically open it up and to say, all right, if we've got a north school and a south school, let's draw the line between the two schools where the two schools are exactly the same size. And so in that scenario, in options 7 and 8, some of Swansea would probably go to the south school. And the disposition of Richmond and Roxbury would be possibly whichever's closer. I know that some parts of Richmond are closer to Swansea, some parts of Richmond are closer to Fitzwilliam, so it kind of depends on where that school ends up being placed. But yeah, it was just almost impossible to make that a school somewhere in between the two work. Yeah.
The option that you discussed, I think there may have been 2, that involved closing Cutler. And either adding on to Mount Caesar or building a new school altogether.
Yeah.
Are those 2 distinct things? Are we talking about there's an option where we build on to Mount Caesar, or build an entire new school on the Mount Caesar property while Mount Caesar is still operating?
My recommendation is to build an addition to Mount Caesar that would house the students from Cutler.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah. And it's viable because you could build a new addition while Cutler still is open.
Sure. And
then move the students over. So I think, once we narrow these options down to 1 or 2 that the board favors, we can start to study those logistics a little bit better. But, that's generally.
I just wanted to make it clear that we're not talking about throwing to the wind the improvements that we made at Mount Caesar. This involves adding on to Mount Caesar, not scrapping Mount Caesar and building a whole new northern school.
The only option that scraps Mount Caesar would be option 6, building one new school. And we've already said that that's not viable. It's too expensive. It's too big. It doesn't work.
Thank you.
And then the last option is the same, basically redistricting so that you have 2 of the same size buildings, but using the Troy site as one of the sites instead of building on new. Again, there's some benefit to that because of the, well, one of the things is the school district owns it. One of the things that's been going through my mind in the past few days is that with the time frame trying to get to district meeting and then to the application in June of next year, to try to find a new property, negotiate the price, buy it, engineer it, and have it ready for an application is close to impossible. Doing an addition to Troy to make it the South Elementary School is definitely doable. Again, I've done similar projects in the past, and you own the site already. The total cost of that project is actually one of the cheapest, and the reason being is that you've got 20,000 square feet of existing building that can be reused. You're not building that new. You're going to save that cost in terms of construction. So if we were to rank these different projects in terms of cost, the additions and renovations end up being the least cost, but only by like $500,000. The next least cost item would be option number 8, the North-South Elementary School, with the north being at Mount Caesar, the south being at Troy.
What was the projection on option 8 for cost?
For the total bond cost?
For option 8.
For option 8 is $23,460,000. Yeah.
Can I defer to Janelle on this, because you did the research? So, for easy, quick numbers, let's say it's a $30 million project that we assume, just so that we understand what we're talking about. Right now, the state projects, or our projection is that the state would help us pay for 56%?
So I've got that in the next slide.
I am right ahead of you.
Yes, you are. So basically, I took each of those bond items and multiplied it by 54%, which is your reimbursement rate. I looked that up today. And this list gives you what those rates are. Now, one thing I found out this morning is that because of past projects that have been done that have been funded by the state, that gets deducted from your square foot allowance for new construction. And so what ends up hurting is option number 6, building a new school. My quick calculations is that right now I'm showing that the state would reimburse you $17 million, but that's not true. The state would probably only fund half of that. So the new school option number 6, which this committee has already said they don't want to do, is even worse in terms of the cost. So, yeah, all these options, 54% ends up being obviously more than half. And when you deduct that from the bond amount, what the state reimburses, what you need to understand is that the state reimburses that amount up front. So you don't have to bond the state reimbursement number. So if a project's $25 million, or say $24 million, and they reimburse you $12 million, you only have to bond $12 million. You don't have to bond the full 24 and then get paid back later. This is an entirely different system than what it was 20 years ago or 10 years ago before the moratorium was put into place. The downside to that is that the amount of money available each year is going to be less because more money is going to the schools that are selected, and it's going to leave less for future projects. So it's going to be harder in the future to get funded, but when you do, you're going to get all your money up front. This last worksheet then takes that bond amount, it takes the life cycle cost analysis and pulls it all together. So basically what these numbers represent is what your true cost is going out 10 years. Now, again, a bond is 20 years, so I'm not There's another 10 years of bond payments on there. So there's a reason why some of these numbers are actually lower than what the bond cost is, because there's another 10 years payment. But your first 10 years, if you look at the cost of doing nothing, the cost of operating the building, the cost of heating and electricity, the cost of maintenance, the staffing costs, you start at a baseline of almost $20 million. Doing the pay-as-you-go scenario, those life cycle costs came up double that of just over $40 million. All the bonded projects end up coming in much less, or close to what the do nothing scheme is. So I think the important thing to note here is that doing nothing is actually one of the more expensive items. The New South Elementary School number 4 is at $20 million, just higher, $1 million higher than do nothing. The option number 5, one of the recommended options from the committee, came in at $18 million, so a good almost $1 million short or less than doing nothing. Option number 6 came in at $20 million. That's the new school option, which we have already said that is not actually viable. And then option number 7, doing a north and south elementary school with the south elementary school on a new site. The life cycle cost analysis came in at just under $16 million. So you're saving with a new school. You're saving a lot in terms of energy. You're saving a lot in terms of staffing. You're saving a lot in terms of increased teacher performance and student performance. The option number 8 comes in close to that same number, around $15 million, and that being the north-south, with north being at Mount Caesar, south being at Troy. So again, the point with this slide is to show that if you look at the true cost of these projects and line them up, that do nothing is actually not the least expensive, that the least expensive options are clearly the options 7 and 8, which is consolidating from 5 schools down to 2. Yep.
Now, of course, there's a lot of assumptions built into this, and one of them is that funding will be available.
Yeah, and that's so what I said earlier about if it's not available, you're still on the list. That it, I know what you're saying, that we don't feel like we can trust the legislature these days because they had promised us for 50 years that we're going to get building aid, and then they took it away. So it is possible that they just don't fund it next year. But if you apply for it and you get approved and then they don't fund it, it doesn't take you off the list. When they do finally fund it, then you'll automatically will get the funding.
And the order in which that takes place, that process takes place,
Yeah.
I'm assuming we don't have to, go out and get a bond and then say, oh, please pay us back. It's, okay, we're going to get some funding from the state, then we can move forward. You're asking a political question to an architect. I'll answer it as best I can. And talking with Amy yesterday, I got some insight on that. Just to give you an example, there were 5 projects that went to bond vote this past March. 3 of them passed. All 5 were approved by the state. Only 3 of them passed funding. The budget hadn't been passed yet. So that happened in March. The budget got passed in September. Apparently, a lot of the legislatures were calling around asking questions. Oh, did this pass? Did that pass? Somehow, the 3 that passed is exactly the amount that the legislature approved for funding. So what you're asking is a very political question. If the Monadnock Regional School District were to apply and get approved for state aid, you would go to bond vote before the budget was passed. You would write your bond article to say that you would only execute that bond if you got state aid. That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah.
Kyle, can you clarify who makes the decision? Is it Amy? Is it a committee? Is it the state legislators? Who makes the committee on which ones get funded and which ones don't?
What has typically happened is they establish a rubric with priority for certain, sort of like a point system. And it doesn't go to the legislature for approval. It usually goes through committee. And I think does it go to governor council?
No.
No? Okay. So
Can we
it's-
get clarification on that? We need outside counsel.
Lisa, a question for you. So Kyle is telling us we can trust our legislature, and eventually the money will be there. If we're on the list and we're approved, eventually the money will be there. Do you buy that?
Well, I don't think Kyle said we need to trust our legislature.
I think I said the opposite, actually.
But I
Okay, you
think
said normally
your
we don't.
story
Okay.
illustrates, what's behind the scenes. But let's put it, if you like Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Michael Jordan said that.
He gets credited to lots of different people, but my point being, if you're not on the list, you don't have any shot at all. So whether we trust the legislature now or in the future, if we hope to do something, we need to get ourselves positioned to do so.
Eric?
We had talked about adding to the proposal, and I know you probably haven't had a chance to do it, about closing the SAU in the Wilcox building, and maybe building a building with the new building.
And I apologize for that not being in the report, and it is on my list of things to do. The reason why it hasn't been done yet is that studying the schools was a much higher priority, and that the numbers here, I think, demonstrate that. The value of the SAU is just a small piece of the whole puzzle. I can give you a synopsis of what it's going to say. It's going to say that the existing building is not viable as an SAU office, that there's too many different levels, there's too many different doorways, it's the age, the condition. It's going to be tough to try to do a reasonable renovation project there. It's certainly possible. Again, to completely renovate or build new, we're talking somewhere in the hundreds of thousands, maybe 400,000 at the most. And when we're looking at total project costs that are 25 to 30 million, it's not going to change any of these options.
No, but what it does do, though, is from a political standpoint, which we're talking about, is you're eliminating buildings.
Yes.
Which is one of the things we're tasked with.
Would that include Wilcox?
Yes. I guess if I could take a second and just recap some of the highlights of the state funding criteria. We were just talking about, that there's going to be, I believe what they're going to do is have a committee that gets together that reviews each of these projects, and there is a rubric. I believe it's already published. We know what that's going to be, and what I've been told is that consolidation is a big part of that. You're going to gain a lot of points if you consolidate schools. There are some points, not a lot, but a few points for reusing historic structures. What else was there? Life safety code issues. So the report, highlights the life safety issues. That's very intentional, so that way the State Department of Education understands, what we're improving here. And then it also ranks based on financial needs. So districts that are less economically sound get higher priority. If you use the state aid reimbursement rates as any kind of indication of what that is, that the Monadnock Regional School District at 54% is one of the highest reimbursement rates, so therefore would be higher in the priority list in terms of being funded. I have, looking through the list of potential projects that are coming up, there's only 2 or 3 that have a higher rate that might be coming up. So looking at these 36 projects that are coming up, if you were to put in early, you would have a much better chance of getting funded because of that reimbursement rate. So those are the highlights in terms of where you're at. Yeah.
So putting you on the spot with all the time you spent with this data,
Yep.
what is your professional opinion on the the direction we should go based on what you found.
We warned you this was coming.
No one wanted to listen.
Let's see.
Is that the next slide? It says thank you.
I highly recommend option 8. Doing an addition to Mount Caesar for a North School and an addition to Troy for a South School. As I said, I think people are going to have a hard time believing that because of Troy, the conditions that it's in, and the status of the site. But if you look at the point system, that consolidating is going to get you points. Reusing the existing building is going to be a good thing. You're going to get points for it being historic. And that, again, I believe that there's a lot of value in that existing building that you're going to recoup if you do an addition to it. That it translates into cost, which makes it the least cost option of all 8 options. Janelle asked me to be prepared with a couple of slides. I mentioned the Florence Rideout Elementary School. This is it before construction. It's a 3-story brick building, almost exactly like Troy. It has a gymnasium that was built afterwards that was separate from it, about the same distance away that Troy's gymnasium is. And then it has this 1-story classroom wing. It's about 5,000 square foot footprint that was sitting out in front of the building. The edge of the building in the front is the property line, and the trees in the back are the property line. This building sits on less than 2 acres. Oop, that's the wrong one. That's it now.
Oh.
What we did is we took down the 1-story wing, which actually came all the way out to the edge of the driveway. Again, that was 5,000 square feet plus or minus. What you see in the back here, this wood, the wood siding piece, actually extends 80 feet beyond that in the back, and is 15,000 square feet of classroom space in 3 stories. So basically filled in the space between the 2 buildings with classroom space, and then added this administration and library and quarter space in the front for security. So I believe strongly that an addition at Troy would work, because I've done an almost identical project to this just a few years ago. It was opened in 2015. So yeah, I've been asked a few times if I had a strong recommendation, and I've been trying to hold back on that because I wanted the report to speak for itself. But I think at this point in time, the data, does show that it's the least cost option with the most benefits. Yes.
And that number 8 was doing a renovation on the Troy site and a renovation on
Mount Caesar
and closing Cutler and all that. The only thing is, what about the disruption to the education process? Because that means you're taking Troy. I can't imagine the renovation would be subtle. I mean, that would be a huge.
So in this particular case, what we did was the space between the 2 buildings was actually empty, and the 1-story wing was out the front. We did the addition, occupied it, then demolished the front and rebuilt the entranceway. So it's absolutely possible. The Raymond Middle School, the Upper Holmes Grove Middle School, was a similar project. 105,000 square feet of building rebuilt on the footprint of the existing building while school was in session. It can be done.
Okay.
Oh. Any other questions? All right. Well, I feel like this is a very, very important endeavor for us tonight, and I appreciate the time that you've put into it. I don't know that there's anything that we need to do this evening unless somebody feels strongly about proposing a next step. We
At
will
the very
be,
least, I'd like to see it on the agenda for next week.
yeah. And we will be for Saturday, you think, or next week?
Next meeting.
2 weeks from now when we're.
Ours come up Saturday,
Yeah.
too.
We also need to get those books in our hands too, so
Yes.
we'll be seeing those shortly, correct?
Yes,
Yeah. Is it available in a digital version as well,
yes.
with the addendums?
Not yet with the addendum. That's coming soon, though. I'll work on that this week. I can get you the books of what I just handed out this week and the addendum next week.
Okay. Rob?
Lisa, do you remember we talked about that timeline? Can you give them, the rest of the group, maybe the next couple of months, what that looks like?
I mean, the biggest benchmark coming up would be preparing to be able to have a warrant article for engineering and design work, because any application we would need to make would be for July 1. And so being able to identify an option that we can then, work with Community Relations and Facilities Committee to get the word out to educate folks in advance of deliberative session and the ballot, because we need those engineering and design studies in order to be able to put forth an application in July. Oh, and a letter of interest, January 1, yep.
And then we put forth the application in July, we wait to see if it's approved, and then we create a bond warrant article?
Correct.
Okay. Nick?
Just two questions. The recommended path that you've given tonight, was it we had two very close options that involved Gilsum. What was the option that you selected in terms of Gilsum?
I've kind of intentionally left Gilsum in purgatory here because it's impossible for me looking at it from an architectural standpoint and a program standpoint and say it's a good idea to do additions and renovations. The numbers of students makes it less efficient than some of the others, some of the other options. But I also understand that there's political will behind it, and that I personally feel bad about closing any neighborhood school. And because of the distance from Gilsum to the rest of the schools, I think that it should be left as an option to potentially just leave it the way it is, keep it open. But that's a political question, not an architectural question.
Gotcha. And I guess the other thing that was rolling around in the back of my head, comparing, in addition to Troy School and closing Fitzwilliam versus in addition to the Fitzwilliam School and closing Troy, was that looked at?
No. If you look at the shape of Emerson,
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't know how to do it. Troy lends itself for doing that. Emerson would be very difficult to do a decent addition to without doing some surgery to take out parts of it. And then the site even, there's a lot of land, but that's in the back of it, not on the sides or in the front. And I think that lastly, if you look at the maps, the distances, Troy is a little bit more central than Fitzwilliam. And so, in terms of trying to recognize those travel distances. And again, lastly, another item I didn't even mention in the life cycle cost analysis, I included busing. The last
You included busing.
busing. The last meeting I was at, Janelle, what's the cost of busing for the district?
1.2, 1.5?
That's a lot of money. And so when you think about busing, if you increase your busing, if you've got putting a new school halfway between two communities does not make it more convenient for everybody. It makes it more inconvenient for everybody. But if you locate that school in the denser part of town, you have the ability of some of the students to be able to walk and for parents to be able to get there. When you look at the demographic layout, the only area that's very dense is downtown Troy. Fitzwilliam is less dense. Richmond is much less dense. So to try to lessen your busing costs, and with 1.2 million in busing, it's a significant number. Troy seems to be the location that would be the best in terms of catching those students.
Thank you.
Rob?
I'd like to commend Kyle, because I sat in on a lot of those meetings, and the amount of work and the depth of work and detail that he was able to capture, get into, analyze, and make sense to people like me who aren't that bright is really remarkable. And remember, our committee, prior to hiring Kyle, was engaged in this work, and we didn't even know where to start. And Kyle, thank you for making sense of it and doing a really good job. What I guess I would say, and I would defer to you as the chair of the committee, is you heard Kyle, you asked Kyle point blank what his is, option is his preference. The committee was able to summarize it. The committee as a group, did we get down to 3? We got down to 3, and so what I guess I'm saying is Kyle
Changed slightly.
did a very, very successful job of navigating the landmines and not getting into the political mess and really keeping it at a data-driven study. I think it's our job now to take the options that we've dwindled it down to and kind of move the needle forward from there. So thank you, Kyle.
Oh, thank you. I think, what's important about all that is, I don't expect everybody that reads these reports to understand every little bit that's in there, but I want people to have some confidence that what's in the report is accurate. So, thank you.